Good evening. Thank you all for coming out tonight to this wonderful event. Thanks to the University of Chicago for providing such a beautiful space, the home of the Chicago manual style, or perhaps the seat of the manual. I am very excited to be a part of off-air event hosted by WBEZ. I am not an academic, however. I was one in a past life, nor am I in publishing or an editor, but I do host a program that is focused on Chicago, on the region, and so in thinking about the manual style, I was coming at it from the perspective of what does this mean to Chicagoans? And you know, here in Chicago, we like to think about ourselves through our icons, the Chicago-style hot dog, the Hancock Building, Oprah, Roberto Clemente, things like that, Comiskey, Wrigley Field. And I think of the Manual of Style as an icon in its own right. I mean, think about those icons. They come and go over time. Goodbye, Oprah. Hello, Rosie. Goodbye, Sears Tower. Hello, Willis. Goodbye, Comiskey. Hello, U.S. Cellular Field. But for over 100 years, 105 years, the Chicago manual style has been going strong. And if you doubt that it's an icon, first of all, just look at this thing. If that's not an icon-sized book, I don't know what is. But also, throughout its history, when people say, what does Chicago have to say on the subject, they're not talking about the previous mayor or the current mayor. They're not even talking about Oprah. They're talking about the Manual of Style. You know, that's its nickname, Chicago. So icon it is, and would that it was a source for us to resolve debates over whether we should call it the Sears Tower or the Willis Tower or Marshall's Field or Macy's, but it's not going to help us out there, even though there is a really nice segment on, or section on, trademarks and brands. So we've got a lot going on tonight. We've got the audience here with us at International House at the University of Chicago to start. We've also got our virtual audience. People are joining us via a live web stream, and that's being hosted by the University of Chicago, so thank you for that. And that's at the University of Chicago Facebook page as well. And of course, we have got our amazing panel. So I want to start by introducing the panel and then get into a really important element tonight, and that is this live polling. So I'm going to introduce our panelists by giving brief bios for each of them, but also I've come up with a personalized poll for each one of you. So it's kind of a lightning round, yes or no. So we'll start right here to my right. Carol Saller is the assistant managing editor and senior manuscript editor at the University of Chicago Press. She's also editor of the Chicago Manual of Style Online's Question and Answer, Q&A, which apparently is the car talk of the Chicago Manual. So I'm glad that there's this synergy between public radio and the manual. She's also author of the Subversive copy editor and has written a number of children's books as well. But my question for you, Carol, is studying Latin or working at TV Guide, which was harder?
Studying Latin was definitely harder. Working at TV Guide was a hoot. And that's where I first ran into the Chicago Manual of Style, actually.
Okay.
It was handed to me, and the 13th edition, and I went home and couldn't put it down.
The manual works in mysterious ways. This is the third Chicago Manual style that Anita Samen has under her belt. She was part of the team that worked on the 15th edition, and you started at the press right when the 14th edition was in process. Samen has been at the University of Chicago Press since 1992, currently as managing editor of the books division since 1998, and also you're Carol's boss, right?
Yeah, I guess. Technically, we prefer colleague, but technically, yes.
Okay. And friends.
Yes.
So your polling question, I know you're from New York, but you did your undergraduate degree at the University of Wisconsin, so I have to ask, Wisconsin Badgers, Chicago Maroons, or do you care?
I have to say, I hope I don't get booed out of the room. Badgers.
A few supporters out there. Ben Zimmer, perhaps most importantly, is an alumnus of the University of Chicago. He also had the chutzpah to take on the now defunct On Language column at the New York Times after the death of longtime head of the column, William Safire. He's currently the executive producer of the visual Thesaurus.com and vocabulary.com. Since you're from New Jersey, I'm not going to ask you about sports, but you are a visual guy.
What's that supposed to mean?
So I'll ask you, Jersey Shore, Boardwalk Empire, or Aqua Teen Hunger Force, which is your favorite TV program set in New Jersey?
Wow, that's a tough one. I understand there was a Jersey Shore conference held right here at the University of Chicago not too long ago.
That show also works in mysterious ways.
It certainly does. I can appreciate it in small doses. It probably just depends on my mood. I could be in an Aqua Teen Hunger Force mood, a Jersey Shore mood, or a Boardwalk Empire mood. They all work on their own levels, I think.
So you don't discriminate?
No.
Very nice. Okay. And last but not least, Jason Riggle is the director of the rather exciting sounding Chicago Language Modeling Laboratory. He's an assistant professor in the Department of Linguistics, and I know you have ties to reality TV and social media. We'll talk about that. You've studied Big Brother and OkCupid, which is an online dating service.
Yeah, right, yeah.
But your question is pretty simple because you work in computation. Mac or PC?
Oh, Mac.
Okay.
Definitely.
No hesitation there.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so polling is a big part of the event tonight. Well, a couple things are a big part of it. One is, as you can see on the screen right now, Twitter. We are not having a typical Q&A where you make your way to a microphone and pose your question or comment. Instead, we're going to take all of our questions via Twitter. And it's pretty simple. The hashtag is numeric century of style, so you can post there. We also are going to be giving you poll questions throughout the evening, and you've had a couple of practice samples already, but here's, we'll do a practice round right now, all of us. So the question is, how long before you think most books are published electronically? 100% right now, already happening. Now, there's different ways you can do this. You can Twitter @poll, and you do the code that's next to the answer you want. So already happening, the code would be 286683. Less than 10 years, 286684. More than 40 years, 286686. So you can tweet. You can text a code to 22333. So with your cell phone, just open up a new text message and address it to 22333. And again, plug in the code that corresponds to the answer. So I think we are ready, Breeze, to move to our first poll question. And I believe the poll question is the same question that I'm going to put to the panel, which is, what is style? And Carol, I'm going to have you start us off by answering that question.
Okay. Well, I usually like to start with what it is not. And because I think a lot of people pressed to think about style think first about grammar. And while there is some overlap, style has more to do with more arbitrary decisions of capitalization and hyphenation and whether you italicize the name of a movie or a book title and things like this that might be different in Chicago's manual than they are from the Associated Press manual. So style is a whole raft of writing guidelines that we try to codify for writers so they don't have to think about it every time they set out to write or edit copy.
So ways of writing writ large, but Anita, there is some connection to grammar, right? And in fact, there is a section on grammar.
There is a section
in the style guide.
Yes.
In the manual.
There is a section on grammar in the manual. There is a relationship, and I guess I think about grammar as being the way, if you make an analogy to architecture, that the grammar would be the engineering guidelines that govern the soundness of the structure, whereas the style would be whether you want to be Tudor or mid-century or colonial.
So, or postmodern.
Or postmodern, absolutely.
Where do you think the authority of the manual comes from, Ben? I mean, because you invoked AP style, Carol, and as a journalist and then as an academic, I mean, AP and then the MLA style guides were my Bibles, not the Chicago manual of style. But apparently, according to you and Anita, that's okay. There are not wars between style guides. They're actually kind of friends with benefits, I think is how you put it. But so where does the authority of the Chicago manual of style come from, Ben, do you think? Because it came out of the gates with that, really.
Well, it has this long distinguished history going back, as you say, over a century or more than a century, depending on what you prefer.
We should have a poll question about that.
And you know, as I understand it, it started off as just basically house rules, just a quick guide to mechanics, and obviously it's expanded to what it is today. And I guess it was starting in the 15th edition, the inclusion of grammar and usage as well. And so I think that's indicative of how people look for authority, but authority that can be all-encompassing, that can be comprehensive. And that's certainly the benefit of having something like this, where whatever your question might be about some very minute aspect of punctuation, capitalization, citation, editing, grammar, usage, you can look for the answer there. And so I think it's accrued that kind of authority over time. Certainly, academics, I think, have looked to it over the years. But of course, different writing styles require different guides to it. But it's just, I think, through the years, it's developed that kind of authority where people feel like it's trustworthy, it's reliable, they can turn to it to answer their questions.
Jason, I'm curious because, we're going to talk a lot about the effect of new forms of communication on something like the Manual of Style. And you look, in a way, at what could be considered style groups, participants in a reality television show, but we've already talked about academics or other kind of professional people. We talk about legalese, for example. So how does something like the Manual of Style, how does its authority work up against these kind of codes of language or usages of language that develop among small groups?
Yeah, I think especially with the proliferation of different styles, sort of styles more sort of a set of customs, established codes of conduct, maybe codes of conduct in writing. And as we, move to a more, print-based age, people read so many different types of text now. They all have their own little styles. The ability to sort of pull out some, authority on some sort of standard lingua franca, style franca, whatever, is really useful. And so I think that the merit of a document like that is to be sort of impartial and not sort of embedded in one little parochial group or another. In fact, many of those groups will define themselves by flouting conventions in there, which is how customs work and how groups define themselves.
So far in our survey, what is the definition of style? The majority says way of speaking and writing. And this is the one poll question where there is a definitive answer, I suppose, although we can really dig into even that definitive answer. The remaining poll questions are definitely going to involve interpretation on the part of the audience and on the part of our panelists. But I'm curious, Carol, because we talked a little bit about the reputation of the manual and how familiar people are with it. And it's hard to, does anyone, you talked about not being able to cite this by page number. Hard to imagine anyone who sits down and reads this cover to cover, and yet it's clearly hugely significant. It's the 16th edition, it's grown from just over 200 pages to over 1,000 now. What are our stakes in style? Why do we care so much about style?
Well, first of all, I don't think everyone cares about style.
No.
I think we're a minority here in the room. But people who do care about it, I think, identify, it's, for one thing, a way of, when you read or speak to someone. It's a way of assessing their education level, their intelligence, and we may not have revisited the rules that we learned in grammar school, but we're usually very sure that we know something about style, even if we don't think we know anything about physics or any of the math we learned in school. We do tend to cling to those rules we learned in grammar school, and we do judge people by them. I think it's why people make it a personal point to, and they react emotionally to challenges. If someone challenges whether they quoted something correctly or not.
Right. So it's like a house of style. If someone challenged your fashion, you'd have the same kind of response as if they challenged your.
It is. They make it personal.
We were talking about more than versus over and non-volleyball tweets. If anyone's curious, the Chicago Manual of Style considers both more than and over to be completely acceptable modifiers for numeric quantities. Do the panelists agree with this?
Absolutely.
Yes.
Consensus. This may be one of the few points of consensus for the evening. Don't forget, you can submit your questions, all of you in the room, via Twitter. The hashtag, again, is, you see it up there, numeric symbol century of style. Someone is saying that they definitely have read the manual cover to cover. Not Carlos Lopez. Congratulations, not Carlos Lopez. I mean, Ben, what do you think? I mean, you write so much. You really engage in all kinds of popular debates about language, about the way we use words, the way we write words, about various language groups. You've written about, like, the vocabulary of Mad Men, the television program, or Facebook and what that has done to language use. So what are our stakes in style, given that we see kind of constant change in the way people use language?
Well, these days especially, it can feel like things are in such flux when we're exposed to so many different styles of writing, very informal styles of writing online very often, whether it's through social media, other types of electronically mediated communication. And it's fascinating to watch. Descriptive linguists are having a field day just with all the new data that's at their disposal now in both spoken and written language, and building big collections of texts that can be analyzed in various ways. But it can be so overwhelming just to try to keep up with the fire hose of data when you see something like what's happening right here with Twitter, where even just those people who are using the Century of Style hashtag are creating their own conversations and their own forms of discourse. Twitter has been one of the very interesting things to watch develop its own conventions. There is no Twitter style guide. People are coming up with it on their own, organically. So that can happen, but then at the same time, people can look for, again, a source of authority in a time of great change. And I think for that reason, something like the Chicago Manual of Style helps to be a kind of a touchstone for people who might feel that the earth is shifting under them quite a bit in terms of new forms of discourse, new technologies that form new genres of writing. And so we can return to something familiar, a familiar set of rules that can help to sort of ground people.
Anita, talk about, we just got a tweet from U034534 who tweets, will the manual soon include suggestions for newer media, Facebook, Twitter, texts, etc.?
What kind of suggestions?
It seems like they're open to suggestion.
I think it's already, we have gotten questions in the Q&A on how to cite a tweet. So I think undoubtedly, in the same way that we discussed new media in the 15th and in the 16th, it will continue to expand. But things could be completely different by the time we do the new edition. Twitter could be totally passé. Everything could be all about Tumblr.
So how do you navigate that? I mean, you're not putting out new editions every year, but how do you navigate what is going to be a part of the language that you need to include to address, and what you can kind of sort of, that's a trend that will go away, we don't need to codify that?
Well, I think it's accurate, and please jump in, Carol, if I'm not stating this correctly. I think it's accurate to say that we collect suggestions all the time, and then when the time comes to think about a new edition and sift through, the team of people working on the book will decide what we can include, what we shouldn't include, and how we will present it.
And I think in the case of the 16th, at the time we were finalizing the copy, Twitter was not necessarily certain to be a long-term, stable source, citation source, and maybe we made a mistake by not including Twitter in the current
Have you had
edition.
debates since the publication of the new edition over that?
Oh, not debates. I think we all kind of wish we'd put a citation in there. There wouldn't have been any harm in it, but we didn't want to look passé the minute the book came out.
Yeah.
So it was a judgment call, and there will always be, with the rate technology changes, there will always be judgment calls like that.
For the 15th, we gave instructions on how to cite a website, and also how to cite a website that had been taken down. So
I didn't even know
we
that
thought
was
about
possible, that you could actually take down a website.
Yeah.
The manual knows everything. We have a new poll question up. As we move to new forms of communication, has the importance of proper style, A, heightened, B, diminished, C, neither? What do you guys think? Jason?
I guess probably heightened, I would say. I mean, it's been diluted tremendously. The notion of proper style is going to be specific to the communication medium. I noticed you guys didn't discuss putting in a citation guideline for chat roulette. You know, there's certainly going to be a different level of propriety for naked guy on internet. You know, but as the community of discourse and people writing text sort of fragments into ever more specialized little areas, then the relevance of some sort of rule keeper, sort of impartial observer gets higher and higher. I would say, as Carol was saying, this is a heuristic we use to gauge things even like intelligence. And so this applies to manners of dress too. Before a certain point, someone putting on their hat upside down and backwards would have been thought to be incompetent in some fashion, but there are certain subcultures where a visor sideways and upside down is super ultra cool.
Or even a challenge to prevailing.
Right, exactly. And
ideas
so
of
that's just
hat wearing.
exactly, and flouting the rules. Maybe at some point writing emails in all caps will be cool. Although I think we all for some time will just judge that as a sign of incompetence. And so there has to be, people will fight about what the unmarked style is, what it is to write in a way that's not expressing affinity with a particular subculture. And so for those people, which is sort of fundamentally conservative sort of endeavor, because writing is, of course, more conservative than, say, fashion, there needs to be something to settle the arguments that's not just, what my grammar teacher taught me and I loved and learned.
Well, yeah, and to be fair, presses and social media are in theory engaged in the same process, which is to disseminate information as freely as possible. I don't know about quickness, but so, I mean, Ben, we could say that they could aid and abet one another, not necessarily be something that kind of has an impact, negative or positive, but working in concert.
Oh, absolutely. I think so. I mean, I look at social media a fair bit, and I do sometimes try to figure out how to cite things. It would be nice to know actually how to cite a tweet if I'm writing about the word refudiate, for instance, and I want to cite Sarah Palin's famous tweet on it to know how to do that. But I think that again, just because, as I was saying before, social media helps to build new forms of discourse. And even though we associate style with, as Jason was saying, more conservative forms of writing, at the same time, I mean, the practice of creating all of this text is something that so many people are engaged in so many very innovative and creative ways. And so it will be very interesting to see. I'm always excited to see just how these things develop, and we can basically watch these things unfold in real time now, whether it's Twitter or whatever the next form that people latch onto as a way to express themselves. And when they express themselves, they are looking for guideposts, figuring out conventions, and learning how to express themselves in different types of different styles.
We had a tweet, I think people want to know sort of about some of the more contentious issues from edition to edition, but let's go to something even more specific. Adam Mold wants to know how people feel about the Oxford comma. And we got another one from For Andyman Forever. So Oxford comma. Everybody wants to know about the Oxford comma. Can you explain that first, Anita? And then, where do people line up on the Oxford comma?
First of all, I think of it as the Chicago comma, not the Oxford comma.
Naturally.
Also called the Harvard comma.
Right. I am passionately pro serial comma. Passionately. I think it aids clarity and avoids ambiguity. And there's this hokey little example that people who've heard me talk before have heard me use about the apocryphal book dedication to my parents, the Pope, and Mother Teresa. Reads one way with a series comma and quite another way without it. So I am passionate about it, and it will always be the Chicago comma to me.
Carol, is there something you feel as passionate about as the serial comma?
Oh, well, I wrote a blog post recently about the use of the construction, all lawyers are not liars, instead of not all lawyers are liars. And I think that's a losing battle. I think the feedback made it clear to me that there's no point in holding out for the precise construction. Everybody knows what you mean, but I don't think that's true. I really would fight for that. I edit it when I come across it in a manuscript.
Here's a couple of other questions. Resident of Mars wonders, will the Chicago Manual of Style itself ever abandon the print format? If he is on Mars or she is on Mars, they may well hope for that, but
Wow.
I mean, being online, being in electronic form has been a part of the manual for quite a while now.
Being online is one thing. Being an electronic volume as opposed to a print volume is quite another thing. I find as a professional editor, I need both. I think anybody who works seriously with words needs both. The print edition, if you want a comprehensive overview of a topic. The online, if you know specifically what you want to search for and you want the paragraphs that relate directly to that topic. I think it's possible in the future that it might be an electronic book and an online publication, but I see those as two different things. Whether there will be this beautiful bound object, I hope it will happen forever. Certainly, I hope that in my lifetime, there will always be a beautiful print edition of the book.
But there will also likely be a mobile app. There'll be an app for this, of some kind.
Possibly, yeah. We can get it to do what we want it to do, sure.
Hey Jeannie tweets, with increased information flow, we're becoming more and more compartmentalized. We talked about that a little bit earlier. Will, quote unquote, unmarked style disappear? Jason.
Yeah, I don't think that's possible because they'll always be, sort of all all of these communities, with the increased information flow, we're all going to become much more multi-dialectal. And so just as people who live in countries where many, many languages are spoken, there will always be one that everybody has command of, or in regions at least. And so there will need to be some sort of common style. Maybe for extremely isolated people, these sort of crazily provincial, ultra-rich urban dwellers that have no knowledge of the world around them, maybe they'll communicate in textisms only, but the rest of us will always need some lingua franca.
Ben, what do you think?
Well, I'm distracted by the flow of tweets here, which seem to be quite...
we worried about that, actually.
But there's quite a lot of sentiment in favor of the Oxford comma. People are still tweeting about the Oxford comma, even though we've moved on. And actually, they got a big round of applause here. I'm pro Oxford comma, but I just want to make a sort of a dissenting voice in terms of what Anita was saying about the idea that one form of comma use is necessarily more clear than another. Even though I would favor it in my own writing and writing that I would edit, the lack of the serial comma or the inclusion of the serial comma, I do not feel adds particular clarity. If we happen to be used to it, then we think of it as being more clear. But just the example that you gave, which was the apocryphal dedication to my parents, was it the Pope and Mother Teresa? The Pope and Mother Teresa. If you change that dedication to say, to my father, the Pope and Mother Teresa, then putting in the serial comma actually creates ambiguity, because then it could be my father, the Pope, a positive.
You're right.
Surrounded by commas there.
You're right.
So and there's some.
The other side of the debate gets to finally weigh in. Thank you,
There are
Ben.
similar arguments over punctuation, which we might think of as more logical or more clear. Whether the period or comma goes inside the quotation mark or outside the quotation mark. In the US, it's generally inside. In the UK, generally outside. And if you have grown up with that and are used to seeing it, you might think one is more logical than the other. I think the Brits actually call theirs logical punctuation. So we can get caught up in these debates over style and just have assumptions based on the way that we learned punctuation, capitalization, grammar, style, and so forth. And sometimes lose sight of the fact that variation is not necessarily a bad thing, that there does not have to be one right way. There can be competing styles, there can be shifting styles in different communities, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that.
Oh, we absolutely acknowledge competing styles
Sure.
and shifting styles. And your example actually is an excellent one. I would say, though, looking at as much writing as I've looked at from various people over the years, generally, if you're editing and trying to keep a flow of work going, not having to stop and think every time about whether or not to apply the comma can generally help keep things moving and makes for, putting my editorial services supervisor hat on, make things flow more efficiently. I love your example, and I'm going to remember that. And I guess I need to find another example.
Could I just jump in? I would just like to point out that even though I have not expressed an opinion on the Oxford or Serial or Chicago comma, it's now all over the internet that I am passionately in favor of it. I saw the tweets go by. I saw the retweets go by.
I think they said you were quite elegant in your defense of it as well.
I didn't say, I haven't spoken to it, so.
Well, I mean, here we go, because our latest poll question is communication is best presented quickly, correctly, depends on the information. So, yeah. I am curious because in your Q&A, I was looking at one question you got, which was someone said, and I kind of fall with Ben on the serial comma in terms of the clarity issue, but it was a question about US-oriented versus, and U period, S period, dash or hyphen oriented versus US, no periods, dash oriented, and you said that the manual the person was concerned about the dash coming after the period, and it looked not good, so they wanted to leave the dash out. And you said, well, you could follow the manual of style and just do US, no period. And I was thinking, well, yeah, I like the US, no periods, but I feel like in some ways I just like the minimalist use of punctuation, and that doesn't seem to be, I mean, we can talk about the way you were taught, right? But you can also talk about these new forms of communication that influence that. Like, I feel like presenting communication, presenting text online begs for, or we have become accustomed to doing that in a more minimalist way. So how much is that factored into, I mean, it's aesthetics, right? It's people's I just like it that way.
So are you asking how much that factors into decisions on Chicago style?
Yeah.
Well,
either that you see in the culture writ large, or that you as editors I just like it that way.
Yeah, all of the decisions that go into the manual are group decisions, evolved decisions based on reader feedback, the board of advisors, the principal reviser's draft. We could not generate a backstory for any particular decision. I don't think it just wouldn't be easy to do that. I know that Anita and I disagree on a lot of things and have different impulses. I love punctuation. Anita would get rid of the end dash. And so we talk about these things.
Ben is a passionate defender.
No,
put that on
I'm more
Twitter
of a fan
now.
of the M dash, but I mean that's an interesting point. So there are raging debates over whether to basically combine the N dash and the hyphen.
Oh, well, not raging debates. Nobody agrees with me, so I've given up. I've yet to have anybody show me an example, though, where an N dash was essential to convey meaning, and it. Anyway, I've given up.
I'm still looking for one.
And I will shut up forever about this if somebody can find a
find
good one.
one.
So if you have one out there.
N-dash fans.
I mean, we all know what it is. We all know how to use it. And I just don't think it's an essential piece of punctuation anymore.
I'm seeing this is another, it's a retweet actually about the manual style is a tool, not a weapon. There's a certain poetry in good prose that can't be touched by a style guide. And we also had a question from the same tweeter, Faraz Hussein tweets, what about stream of consciousness prose such as Camus or Eggers? Wouldn't adhering to the manual of style diminish their effectiveness?
Of course. But we wouldn't go in there and try to manual of stylize something that's obviously stream of consciousness.
No, one of the things, we're so misunderstood.
We really are.
I mean, from the
We have a stream of consciousness when we see it.
From the very beginning, the Manual of Style has advocated flexibility in the application of our guidelines and said they were for the typical example and should not be adhered to with rock-ribbed.
Yeah, whatever it is from the. You've got the first edition somewhere. There's a thing about
it's in the first edition.
Law.
We should just point out, we have a lot more style now than we used to. This is a facsimile of the first edition, and this is the new one.
We allow sentence fragments. I mean, it depends on what we're working on and the audience and what the writer's intention is. So certainly for Camus, we would not go in there, and I've been working on a novel that we're doing that has a lot of stream of consciousness in it and a lot of very idiosyncratic punctuation. That is that writer's style, his trademark. I'm not going to go in and manual style it up. That would be counterproductive.
No.
Jason, can I put a question to you? LTVT asks, is there a stylistic way to indicate what style you're following? And so you're looking at the way, at language patterns and how language emerges among groups. I mean, you guys can weigh on this too, but I'm just curious how you would answer that question.
Yeah, right. I think the sort of it depends a lot on how divergent the style is and how important it is to communicate to your audience that you're, speaking in a particular dialect or particular accent, if that's what you're doing. And so usually there's a whole cluster of properties, and people command them and will employ them to different degrees. And so whatever the hallmarks of that style are, you will I think use them. And we're very tightly attuned to these things. When people do something wrong to our mind, when they have the wrong vowels, we get really upset. Or when they, lose some distinction that we have in our dialect, we get really upset. And if they use the serial comma or don't use the serial comma, we get really upset. And I think, we also like to get upset about it. I think, it's a lot like sports teams. And so, you like to hate, your buddy who likes the sport team. You don't really like to hate them, but you like to fight about which way is right. And so that's sort of part of human nature. And so for something as important to language and proper expression, we're just gonna fight about it. We're always gonna make up stuff to fight about, and so.
Well, right, and we're having a fight raging about, well, some people are calling it the N dash and some people are calling it the N, just the letter N dash. So some language evolution going on as we speak.
JK, folks, JK.
No LOL on Twitter right now, no LOL. Is there an easy way just to fly your Chicago Manual style flag? Style flag?
I don't know. A footnote, I guess.
Well, they don't advocate anything really weird, which is probably why we like it. There are certain manuals of style that have come up with just bizarre conventions that have stuck around that are totally off the wall, that don't reflect common usage. And
what's an example of that?
The 5th edition of the Texas Law Review Manual of Style has this weird prohibition against splitting verbs up, some weird over-interpretation of the split infinitive debacle, where already has gone should be has already, or already is gone, has already gone, has already been done, should be already has been done, no matter what, which
that's a bad rule that's been overextended into an even worse rule, this sort of split verb idea. I mean, that's a good example where you would not find the Chicago Manual complaining about split infinitives or other fake rules, basically, like ending a sentence in a preposition, beginning a sentence with a conjunction like and or but. People sometimes latch on to these rules as if they have some worth to them, but if you look through the whole history of the best English writers, you'll find that there really is no such rule, but that people sometimes get it in their heads that there is such a rule, and sometimes feel the need to enforce it in very strange ways.
I mean, it's like a virus. As soon as somebody in authority says something, I could make something up. I could tell you right now that it's poor style to use more than 2 prepositions in a sentence, and people could start doing that. People will
careful.
Please tweet, go for it, spread this meme.
Our latest poll question is up. Can style be flouted on email? And thus far, well, depends on the audience. Again, sort of who are you talking to, less than the actual mode through which you're communicating. Where do you weigh in? Why are we even asking this question? Can style be flouted on email?
I don't know.
I think it really does depend on the audience. If I am sending an email to a member of my family, and there is some grammatical infelicity in that email.
Someone please write that down.
Right.
Grammatical.
That's one thing. If I am sending an email message in my official capacity at the University of Chicago Press, I would try to be a little more careful. That's not to say I've never sent out an email in my official capacity with an error. Of course I have. But I look a little more carefully before I hit send when it's going out in my professional capacity, whereas if it's to a friend or to a family member, they're going to have to love me regardless.
I won't name any names, but I had a boss, and she was an alumnus of the University of Chicago, and she would be with the yeses. Can style be flouted on email? At least in terms of actually composing words that were recognizable. And it didn't matter who those emails went to, from the highest to the lowest. So.
Well, if you're talking about style, though, really, instead of grammar or other things, then that's different. Even in an official email from the University of Chicago, I might not put a hyphen in email just because it's faster, and I'm just banking on the possibility, the likelihood that the recipient doesn't know the difference, which is Chicago style. It doesn't seem important to me to follow Chicago style in an email to someone, or consistency does, though. So I wouldn't.
But
Consistency or effort?
you could consistently keep all of your email messages lowercase or uppercase. I mean, I know people who do that pretty consistently. They may be academic writers or whatever, but when it comes to email, it's just everything is lowercase. And so that may be just a particular style that they've latched onto. If you tried to do that, say in a business situation, though, you would run into problems for sure if you tried to.
Right. No, I'm just talking about the arbitrary decisions where there's no correct answer. I would follow the conservative, conventional business formalities, but I wouldn't necessarily follow Chicago style.
We got a tweet. PR Morrow asks, does style have something to do with style as in beauty? This comes back to aesthetics. We've talked a little bit about that. Seems significant. We don't just call them rules. Jason?
Yeah, I mean, I think we definitely see our editor friends here agreeing with that. That is, you have an author. I mean, we know what good authors write like. None of us who have ever had to edit work, which I've had to too, get upset when a good writer does flout some convention we're familiar with. It's the bad writers we worry about who are inconsistent. They do things all over the place. They have serial commas sometimes, other times not, and then they put some dashes in there, and it's just a hot mess. You don't know what's going on. And so, that's lack of style. Beyond that, you can pick what to do, and we all know that none of these little details, serial commas or M or N dashes, have anything to do with great writing, which is where style happens.
Right, we had another tweet. Maybe you guys, our producers in the back, Breeze and Katie, and they're toggling between the Twitter page and then comments. Write emails in good style. You give an impression that good writing is just natural for you, even in that fast medium, which sort of underscores what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that you really see in email, which is quite interesting, and in most written discourse, is the same thing that you have in speech, which is that effort is interpreted as respect and as politeness. And so we know that when people are speaking in more formal registers, or when they want something, or when they're talking to someone that they're trying to impress, they use less contractions, they drop fewer words, they pronounce things more fully, they talk more slowly. All of this stuff is more effortful. And so when someone writes an email asking for a job, they're probably going to do all of these highly effortful things, sometimes to comic effect. And so when you write in all lowercase, it just seems
your humble servant.
Right, exactly. They're going to curtsy, right? And so, but if it's casual,
regards.
What's that?
With deepest kindest
Indeed,
regards.
exactly, right.
But if somebody sends an email wanting to be a freelance editor for us, and something is misspelled, or there's a word left out, and they're telling me how meticulous they are, I have to wonder.
Right. Yeah, it's like being sick the first day of your new job, right? You have to make a good impression, right? And so,
I would mind that a whole lot less than sending me an email message telling me how meticulous you are and how you want to edit for the University of Chicago Press, and you've misspelled something or you've left a word out.
It's interesting, though, because the effort that we put and sort of how that signifies value or worth, and I mean, again, all of these things are kind of laden, with other kinds of judgments. But Ben, you've been writing, or you talked, I think, on radio about these kind of lightning, effortless, almost changes in language. For example, the Occupy movement and how that has brought Occupy into a whole different context. And you're talking about a change in language that is happening in a mere month, not even months, but a month, you see this transformation.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's what's simultaneously exciting for people who study language, and also very daunting that so much change can happen so quickly. You can take just a word like Occupy, which has been in the language for centuries, and because of the Occupy Wall Street movement, all of a sudden it's being used in ways it just hadn't been used before. Not just simply as occupy blank, fill in the name of your town, but as a new kind of intransitive verb that simply means to take part in the movement, as a kind of a noun that can modify other nouns, occupy protest, occupy movement, and something like Twitter actually can play a big role in that with hashtags, as we were talking about, becoming these sort of slogans or mantras that people can use, and so yeah, I mean the fact that we can just watch that unfold and see it happen over the course of days and months is exciting. I mean, it's a great time, I think, to be studying language and the way language changes, because we have all of these insights that we didn't necessarily have before. We had so many ways of collecting new kinds of language data. Very often people on the fly, they're not concerned about style. They're not concerned about the niceties of punctuation and so forth. But at the same time, they are finding ways of expressing themselves that are innovative. They're seeing what patterns are out there, and things can go viral in ways that we can actually track now. So it's fascinating to watch, but all of that seems sometimes very distant from the world of the Chicago Manual of Style. Jason was talking about the necessity for effort, or the appearance of effort, in showing that you can command a formal register. Well, in so many other types of interactions online, whether it's Twitter or elsewhere, the appearance of effort is a detriment, actually. You would not want to be seen as overly effortful in many contexts where that would simply be seen as stuffy, stilted, just inappropriate to the context. And another question that's raised then is, if children are coming up in this kind of environment, how best do we teach them to discern the appropriateness of these different forms for different contexts, so that they know what stays on Twitter, what's appropriate for an email to your professor versus an email to your friend, and that sort of thing.
We had a tweet that maybe would offer a solution to that. For Andy Mann writes, style and word choice are like wardrobes. Sometimes you write in a suit and tie, and sometimes you write in your sweats. So maybe we just tell children they have to dress appropriate to the style they're attempting to engage with in their writing. But Jason, I mean, how well do you think we're navigating those sort of these quick changes in language that evolve out of groups that, you know, are engaged in something entirely different, and then between that and something like the Manual of Style, where this is something that many, many groups use, and in fact, its authority resides in that idea that it appeals across groups, or that, you know, that it has some kind of significance across groups.
Yeah, I think that kids today, or, you know, us, we seem to be navigating it pretty well. I think it's, you know, it's not categorically different than what's always gone on with groups of people, you know, sort of negotiating conventions of how to refer to things and how to talk about things. The thing that's amazing about it now is it's all recorded, it's all there, we can look at it, it's, you know, temporally asynchronous and geographically dispersed, and far more people are participating in the conversation, and so you have the possibility for, you know, huge numbers of people to adopt a new convention basically instantly. But I think, you know, as humans, we're wired to attend to these kinds of things, and I think kids, you know, recognize register when they see it, and they will interpret it differently than their elders, and we will get angry about it. That is guaranteed to happen, but I don't think that that they'll have much trouble with it. It might be too fast for us, might be too fast for me at some point. Once they're navigating smell gradients and they've got to attach the right, you know, 3D printer tags to their subviral texts, then, you know, I'm going to be in trouble, right? But because I won't know how to operate those things.
Right.
You know, but I think my kids help me.
Our latest poll question asks, does the misuse of language diminish authority? And the yeses have it thus far at 88% of respondents say yes. I mean, that seems to kind of go a little bit against the earlier question about can style be flouted? You know, can you abandon it in certain mediums? What do you, I mean, obviously as purveyors of the Manual of Style, you must be concerned with the issue of authority. Anita.
Well, misuse of language. Again, if an author is writing in stream of consciousness or deliberately writing in non-standard English, that, for that author's message, is an appropriate use of language. And where the manual of style can help is to give advice about how possibly to set off typographically things that are examples of non-standard speech patterns, or arranging the text so that it's clear that somebody is presenting language in a particular way. And in terms of diminishing authority, I don't know that every purpose of communication is to appear authoritative.
What is a use of language that drives you round the bend? Or one that comes up again and again? That...
Do I dare, after the N dash thing, voice an opinion?
Yes!
Boy, there are so many, and apparently...
You could just throw out a few, and then you've got some coverage. You know?
Well, but people will disagree with me. I really don't like comprised of. And I know that people have said that ship has sailed, it's perfectly fine. It bothers me, and I don't like it.
We talked about Oprah. I'm feeling like Oprah right now. Like,
Yeah.
Why?
Years ago, no, I'm kidding. There's no, it may be because when I was a young editor and the distinction was being made much more firmly between the whole is the whole comprises, whatever the rule is, I don't even remember what it was. And my fledgling editor nose was rubbed in the fact that I didn't know the difference. It sort of stuck with me.
So these style challenges do lie behind every kind of contentious issue within style.
It's a hazing, basically. You
Right.
get abused by people who know
Someone's
the
been
rules.
abused
Yeah, right.
early on.
You need to become the abuser.
I think misuse of language, I think of grammar, non-standard grammar, and that's where we really draw a line. At the University of Chicago Press, our publications are expected to be in standard English grammar. So if someone says he gave it to Jim and I, we would edit it to me.
Right.
For the
Unless it's
sake of
dialogue.
of course, there
then we'd
are
leave it.
always exceptions, but
Yeah.
if it's just text in an academic book,
Yeah.
we would edit conservatively, and that's what I would call misuse. If it's used in if it's not standard in a context where it should be, where readers expect it to be standard. It's reader expectation, reader comfort, not distracting the reader. That's when we go in.
Right, although if you let it in, I mean, maybe not grammar, but if you let it in, then it becomes part of the repertoire, right? And I don't know if this is a
Right.
misuse of language, but Tohasal would like to hear your thoughts about something I thought we'd left behind but have a power that's quite amazing, emoticons.
Oh, we were talking about emoticons in the green room.
So, Ben, you started us off.
Well, yeah, no, we were discussing how Anita and I had a similar experience of being sort of anti-emoticon, and then realizing that emoticons were creeping into our messages, whether it's different forms of chat or whatever.
Is it because someone else used it when you were corresponding with them? I mean,
Well,
the peer pressure factor?
peer pressure.
That's what I think is the gateway to the emoticon use. No, I don't.
You are trying to fit into a particular norm, and norms involving emoticon usage are evolving. I mean, there's some interesting research that a grad student at Stanford is looking at the evolution of emoticons. And so, for instance, the original ones had noses. If you had the the colon and the line for the nose. But there's been a big onslaught of noseless emoticons, and those noseless emoticons are associated more with younger
Kids these days.
the kids these days. Leaving the noses off the emoticons. What's going on?
These
Yeah, it's
debates recur over and over again on Facebook, I should say, to nose or not to nose when using emoticons.
So even with something that seems to be as recent and as transient as emoticon use, we can already trace sort of developments in the history of it, and what happens when they get used on Twitter or other venues like that. I mean, there's a whole sociology of emoticon use that may at first seem completely trivial. But then when you think about it, what does it lend to online communication? Well, it lends a certain kind of affective stance to your writing that we have in speech, because we can say something sarcastically, we can give air quotes, we can do all these paralinguistic things to show that we're not quite serious about something. But when we're doing it online, it helps to have something to perhaps diffuse something that might be taken too seriously. Earlier you said JK for just kidding. That would be another shorthand. And so that can be extremely important for certain types of discourse, like Twitter, where you only have a little bit of space, and so you have to get your message across in that particular way, and so they become extremely useful.
Just quickly, I want to get Jason to weigh in, since you do a lot of observing of evolution of language among groups. But based on Anita's opinion of comprised of, for Andy Mann would like to know if she will marry him.
Well, we
I don't know if I can
open
answer
audience, so friend me on Facebook, we'll talk.
I mean, I think the comprised of is a really good example, and the coordinate structures and pronoun use there is great, because a lot of usage. So the more conservative rule doesn't reflect usage for many speech communities. I grew up in a speech community that has a different rule for coordinate structures, which is internally consistent, and it's what people use in speech. But when I was taught to write professionally, I learned to do the dance that is the academic writing dance, and I think it's ultimately arbitrary what you choose. One may be more historically conservative, preserving what was there, but it's part of having an effortful style. It has to not match what people say. A lot of writing, the things that are great about writing is there's all these commas and stuff which nobody knows. There's no way to say it. It's only there in writing. And so those are the things we're going to fight about, M dashes and N dashes. But then the things that exist in speech too, some of the best things to fight about are things that don't actually reflect common casual usage, because then it's very possible to establish that you're writing properly and effortfully by adhering to some set of styles, whatever. But if everybody sort of knows what that is, then people know what you're doing. And so I think that's why it's good to have some notion of bad writing, right? Which is within the context of the notion of effortful writing, right? Not casual writing.
Poll question, does the Chicago Manual of Style aim to reflect trends, set trends, or neither? Carol.
Well, we don't, the editions come out several years apart, so it's not likely that the manual is going to be on the top of trends, maybe in the year that it comes out. No, we think about trends that we see, we look at reader feedback, and we talk about things that are, the example I gave before about the grammar of he gave it to Jim and I, that's in flux now. And by the time the next edition comes out, maybe that'll be accepted and we'll go with it. But we do tend to be conservative.
I was listening for gasps when you said that.
Well, we listen.
We're all getting so used to hearing it.
Yeah. So we do listen, but because of our main readership, which are scholars who tend to be conservative in what they accept as standard grammar, we're not looking to shock them in our publications, and the manual's written for our use. So.
I would say, though, that my answer to that question is not up there. My answer to that question would be both, kinda. When we, in the 15th edition, when we decided how we would style the term website, which we have changed in the 16th, a lot of publications followed suit. And so in the 15th edition, it was 2 words with a capital W. And we put a lot of thought into that. There was a lot of shockingly heated debate about what to do about this. And I do think in that instance, we did perhaps set a trend. It was based on some of what we were seeing, although we weren't seeing that much. We made a decision, and a lot of people went along with it. And then we reversed the decision in the 16th.
When you reverse the decision, though, you end up reflecting the trend that
exactly.
the
That's
larger
why I'm
trend,
saying both.
Right. I mean, it's interesting just with that one example. Various usage guides have gone along now with lowercase w website, 1 word. The AP Style Guide, I think, recently made that change. New York Times continues to do capital W web space site, but obviously they have a more conservative view of that, along with many other points of style. So yeah, no, it's interesting. Just from the change from one edition to the next, you were seen as setting the trend and then backing off from that and accepting a larger trend.
Well, yes, and thinking about the rationale behind it, and also, I don't remember the exact discussion, but I think there was also some talk about whether it was worth it to do a cap letter and have a space, and everybody knew it. Anyway, it was something that we considered, which is why I say both, which is one of the things I love about being affiliated with the manual, because get to do both things with language.
Jason, in terms of some of the groups that you're looking at, so the participants on a reality TV show like Big Brother, can you talk about language patterns or language use that are evolving out of a context like that look interesting but might have this kind of, what Anita was just describing, it's really not settled whether this is going to be the way we'll all do it or not?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's this is ongoing research. It's mainly been being run by graduate students here at the University of Chicago and some at MIT. And I'm a latecomer to the game, but it's fun to watch a bunch of narcissistic 20-somethings fight with each other, locked in a house for 92 days, 93 days. Could never get permission to run this experiment. The sort of the fun thing about the things that we can track is it's a totally closed linguistic environment. So the 4 people that are there the whole time only ever talk to people that are there in the house. It sounds horrible. And the things that are, I guess, most interesting, at least to me personally, that have come up is to see that people are very different. Some of the people that are there the whole time, they're very stable in the things that we've been tracking. These are like, fine properties of vowels and voicing of consonants, and also rates of dropping final consonants at the ends of words and compounds and things like that. But some people just do the same thing all the time, no matter what. Some people kind of fluctuate randomly, but around a point, and some people show these trends, and so far we're trying to see if they match each other, but it's a lot of fancy statistics. But we seem to have about equal numbers in each group, and though the sort of technology to study this on a very individualized level for people is only sort of around recently, I bet that's how people are. I mean, we all know people who emigrate to a country relatively late in life and then, have totally unaccented speech, and yet still other people who come when they're 5 and still sound like they're from somewhere else. And so it's surely the case that people are very different person by person. And so being able to study these groups, you see that probably it will be the same with writing. That is, some people will adapt to new styles as they come and will be flexible, and other people will just stick to their guns no matter what. Maybe even obliviously so, not necessarily with great gusto.
Here's another question. Mouse Jammer asks, how do you balance prescriptive and descriptive approaches to style in the Chicago Manual of Style? And that could apply, I think, to all of you and your pursuits. Sort of a variation on the reflecting or setting trends. But do you want to start us off, Carol? Or?
Well, we do balance it. I think out in the world we're perceived as totally prescriptive, but really for anyone who's familiar with the manual, we try to model flexibility throughout, and in deciding what will change, the way Anita was describing, we look at what's happening in our manuscripts and feedback, and we incorporate it.
But there was a request going from the 15th to the 16th that we become more, I don't even know if prescriptive is the right word.
Give fewer choices.
Give fewer choices. And for me,
The
that
framework's
was
getting smaller.
well, for me, that was the most amazing thing about discovering the manual of style when I was a young editor, that if I was working hard on a manuscript and kind of beating my brains out about how to help somebody phrase something a little more clearly, the manual would tell me if numbers were involved, numerals or words. It was in there when you use numerals and when you use words. I didn't have to think about it. I just had to know it was in the book and look it up. And that was so freeing that I didn't have to reinvent the wheel every time while I was editing. So having fewer choices was helpful to me.
But to Jason's point that some people are open to change and other people resist it, I mean, you have audiences, I guess, that have lived through various editions of the Chicago Manual of Style, some of which have had big changes in them. So what do you hear from people when suddenly, comforting, that framework they've relied on is no longer there? Whether it's a word like website or something else.
I think the point we make is you don't necessarily need to do it the way we do it, but we give you an idea of the kinds of things you need to think about capitalization, hyphenation, italicizing things, what terms to set off. Do it our way, don't do it our way, but this is something that you need to think about when you are preparing your work for publication in whatever medium.
Okay. Let's go to another tweet. This is pet peeves, and we are going to go through a number of pet peeves before we end the night, since they seem to have broad appeal. Scott Knitter writes, when I read things like, she gave the money to we who will buy the food, I want to leave the planet. I will never get this. Ben?
She gave the money to we who will buy the food.
Yes.
I'm just trying to imagine someone saying that. And anyway, but there are problems that are acknowledged in the grammar and usage section of the Chicago Manual of Style when you have questions of what case to use for the pronoun and when it seems to be serving two purposes and that sort of thing. And Brian Garner, who wrote that section, actually has an interesting kind of advice for that sort of situation. He says it may be best to use what he calls preventive grammar, where basically you avoid you avoid that, you rephrase it because you could be technically correct but sound artificial or stodgy or something like that. And so in order to deal with that situation, you just rephrase it, you recast the sentence in some way. And that seems to be the case very often in areas of usage and grammar that might be shifting a bit. You have a kind of a traditionalist point of view or an older point of view that might be losing ground to something newer. And in order not to annoy one camp or the other, you just avoid that completely. And so it's this kind of avoidance strategy that comes up in the Chicago Manual and other usage guides, which I find fascinating because if there's an avoidance like that going on, I think that's a good sign that there's some sort of big change happening.
Something's in
whether
flux,
right,
yeah.
I mean, whether it's the use of whom versus who, for instance. If whom is on its way out of the language, except in certain sort of particular contexts, following a preposition. There we go.
The pole
let's see
of
how
God
that goes.
is speaking. I mean, this is our lightning round. Is whom now extinct? You can weigh in, and I'll put it to you guys. Is whom now extinct?
It's not extinct, but I think it is on its way out.
And
endangered.
that's something I've been hearing when I worked at Scribner's. I think it might even have been in the late 70s. There was an author who was arguing for the abolition of whom. So this is not a new debate. And he actually had a chapter in his book called Who's Kicking Who? So.
Jason, what were you saying?
I'm just saying it's endangered, clearly.
It's endangered.
Yeah, and
Like shall is another,
Right.
another example,
Yeah.
too. Shall seems to be headed out the door. If you try to use it now, it might sound ridiculous. Or if you say, shall I do this or that, you sound quite antiquated. It still might have some purpose in, say legal writing. The person X shall do such and such a thing. But words like shall and whom, just like many other words in the language, may just fall out of favor, be seen as a relic of the past.
And they'll still survive, and probably like there'll be little pockets where they survive, little set phrases that'll be almost idiomatic.
Yeah, like,
But-
shall we?
Right,
Maybe
exactly.
that would
Right,
stick.
that may stick around.
Shall we
exactly.
dance?
And people,
And whom for 30 years now has been on its way out, but
yeah.
it's still here.
Not dead
It's
yet.
still here in this room, 78%. It's not going away.
Oh, hang in there.
Just quickly before we move into the next one, Carol, in the Subversive copy editor, you essentially, you arbitrate, or you are an arbitrator of sort between kind of contests over language, maybe particularly between a writer and editor, and you've been on both sides of that. But I was thinking, as Ben, you were talking that, and again, to invoke Oprah, maybe we need to sort of practice detachment around some of these issues or what's happening to language. How do you counsel people to kind of disengage a little bit, or do you?
I do, and I think people are really respond to that. In the Q&A, we see it. People write in to ask whether something's correct, and we say, this is Chicago style, but the other way is not incorrect. And quite often they respond with thanks. They had never thought of it that way. They really were thinking in terms of correct and incorrect rather than just different styles. They find it liberating.
The way Anita can find, like, a definitive answer can be liberating, but sometimes, like, you could do it either way is liberating.
And again,
not to create controversy.
No,
between you two.
but circumstance is so important. If you are taking an editing test and you are not sure, if you've been told to follow Chicago Manual of Style and you're not sure whether the person you're taking a test for is a loose constructionist or a strict constructionist, I would err on the side of being a strict constructionist. So it really depends. And some of our authors expect us to interpret these things very strictly and are disappointed when we don't. So that's where judgment comes in. You have to really know what your mission is.
Next lightning round, which is most correct? Email, all one word, or dash, hyphen, mail, hyphen. Email as one word wins. So far, you can try and change the outcome if you want.
That's another case. Very, very often.
We get tons of tweets about this, by the way. Yeah.
People may see the hyphenated form, which is sort of historically older, as on its way out, or representing a more conservative spelling. I mentioned the New York Times is often more conservative on many of these style points. They still hyphenate email, while other style guides have, including I believe the AP, have said you don't need to use the hyphen now. Is Chicago Manual also?
We do use it.
No, you still do.
I
Okay.
like the hyphen. I mean,
That's going to get you more proposals of marriage.
I keep looking at email without a hyphen and saying, what is the stuffy mal that I'm supposed to know about? I mean, it doesn't bother me, but I don't think less of you if you don't put a hyphen in.
Although I think
interesting that, oh, go ahead, no.
I mean, I think some of the stuff with the hyphen and the end dash, a lot of that is adaptation to different writing constraints. And so if one's writing in narrow columns, you've got this line wrap problem. And so the more hyphens and dashes you have, the more likely you are to have one hit the end of a line. And so it's kind of annoying to have E be on one line and male be on the other because your word processor thinks that, you're happy to have a line break there. And so the new convention conforms nicely to narrow columns, and so.
Good point.
Camel case.
D-Bird tweets, I use shall all the time, but it doesn't make me as happy as when I can work shan't into the conversation. Final lightning round question, which is a relative term here tonight, how lightning we're being in our round. Should there ever be used as a non-gendered singular pronoun? Ben.
Well, I'm all for the use of they and their as non-gendered singular pronoun. It actually has a lot of history behind it, and there are definitely trends in that direction. It's the best of many imperfect solutions in to fulfill this role in the language. I believe that's still discouraged in the current Chicago manual, although in the next edition it'd be interesting to see, because I think that is one change that we can currently see happening where that is becoming more accepted. In certain types of writing, I think it's perfectly fine. In the most formal registers, perhaps, it might be seen as inappropriate.
The Chicago Manual of Style actually accepted the singular there in a footnote on page 76 of the 14th edition,
and then
I know because and I think it was footnote number 9, but I could be wrong about that. I know it was on page 76, and it was the second part of a note that also dealt with split infinitives. And it was highly, highly controversial. I don't actually remember what we did in the 15th, but I know we changed our recommendation in the 16th. I agree with you completely about it, and in the note in the 14th edition, we cited some of the writers of note in the world who had used the singular there. So we did change, and I think we may change back.
Interesting.
Carol, do you want to add anything to that?
I agree absolutely in theory. I have trouble using it myself.
Why?
I tend to rephrase. I don't know.
It just feels wrong.
It does feel wrong, but I see I don't have a better alternative. There are times when I just weary of trying to write my way out of it, so I'm going to cave soon.
It's so exhausting to try to write your way out of it all the time.
Yeah.
Well, we have a tweet about that. A.M. Horton, who I think maybe proposed marriage to you, is tweeting again. I really don't think that there's a good alternative to they as a gender neutral. His or her, really?
No, there isn't.
No, it definitely works the best, and especially in certain types of sentences where they or there is agreeing with everyone or anyone. So everyone, please return to their seats, that sort of thing. They're really that particular use of singular they or singular there has become more acceptable. I know the American Heritage Dictionary just recently published its 5th edition, and they have a usage panel of about 200 distinguished writers and thinkers who are surveyed on these points, and there's been a gradual acceptance of that. I believe in the most recent survey, a majority accepted singular there in those cases where it's agreeing with everyone or anyone. But there can be a kind of a gradual acceptance of these things, which might start with certain cases like that, and that kind of usage can gain a foothold, and then from there it can spread more widely into other contexts.
Susie_Allen, the audience at #Century of Style just applauded a footnote. I love you all very much. I just had to give you your own props. So just final go round from all of you. We've just talked about something that we really don't have a good alternative to, so it's unlikely to be resolved. But what are other outstanding issues of style that you think we're going to be debating over for some time?
There are some issues that just won't die, even though language writers have disposed of them thoroughly. One that's always available on the internet for debate, and even Invective, is the use of the passive. People, I guess it's Strunk and White, think it's incorrect. There's a fantasy people have that you should eliminate it from all of your writing, and it's impossible to do that and write well, and yet that's an issue that just clings in popular debate.
Anita?
Wow. Well, I already talked about dashes and dashes anyway. So, and I talked about comprised of. What do I have left that really? It's hard for me to come up with something specific. Why don't I pass to Ben, and maybe I'll think of something.
Well, just to follow up on Carol's point about the passive, I mean, we do see that again and again, and whether it's Strunk and White exerting this influence from the grave, but very often what we find, this comes up again and again on Language Log, a linguistics blog that I contribute to. People who are complaining about the use of the passive don't really have a clear sense of what the passive is. They identify things as being passive that are not, in point of fact, in the passive voice. And so what they're complaining about actually is not about what linguists identify as the passive voice, but something else, something about ways of writing that seem to obscure the agent or who's responsible for it. And that is what is identified as passive, even if it's not strictly grammatically passive. So, I mean, so what it often points to is people don't like the government or military or whatever trying to describe events without ascribing a certain agent who performed an action, that it obscures, it euphemizes, or other ways of being indirect, and that's what people seem to have a problem with more than necessarily the actual grammatical structure.
Or
of a
personify as an entity or something like that. Yeah.
Right.
Jason, anything you'd add?
What he said, no. I mean, no, I agree with the passive entirely. I mean, I think the lengths that people go to avoid some of these non-rules is hilarious. I mean, that's my go-to example of bad writing, is these incredibly circumlocucious constructions just to avoid using something obvious. But I guess if I had to predict what the next, if we reconvene this panel, 10 years from now, what we'd be talking about, I'd probably guess quotes, since they seem to be crazy and nobody seems to know what to do with them. I mean, a lot of us use quotes, but just I have a whole set of pictures on my phone of crazy uses of quotes. Only one, random words. And so clearly people mean something with them. I do not know what it is, but maybe when my kids are old enough to articulate what it is the crazy kids these days are doing to me, then we'll figure it out.
Form of emphasis.
Yeah, something like that. It's like italics or something like that, but I just don't know it. So I'm excited to find out what quotes mean. Crazy people with a free coffee,
Well, I want to thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Jason Riggle, Ben Zimmer, Anita Samen, and Carol Saller, and thanks to all of you as well.